All right, we're live. This is Mr. D, and with me is Mr. B, I suppose we'll call
Yeah,
you.
that'd work.
All right, today we're going to talk about Civil War battles. Mr. B, you should be seeing my screen,
I
and
am.
on it you're seeing the North and the South. Today we're going to focus on Civil War battles. Hopefully, in 15 to 20 minutes, we will cover the battles that I guess students should know, even though I doubt there will ever be battle questions on any end of grade test. Do you suppose that would ever happen? I think these are just going to be kind of.
No, I don't think they are trying to get away from the dates and times and histories because somebody somewhere hated history for that very reason, and so now they're in power, and they hate dates and times and battles. So
Yeah,
we're gonna be
battles of I guess they fought themselves out of history, and it's just not testable anymore. And this is it. So, and there's really nothing. I don't know. Some people who got into history loved the battles, and that's what got them to fall in love with social studies. But
right.
unfortunately, those are not the people in power anymore. So, 30 years ago, well, when I was way back when I was in school, we spent a lot of time studying battles.
Oh yeah.
Today, we do not study battles at all. So you will get the very quick version. And on the screen, you'll see kind of a quick visual of the differences in terms of strengths and weaknesses. The North had more railroads, population, money, industrialization. The South had better generals. It's a home field game of sorts for them, and they had King Cotton. Any strengths and weaknesses that you want to put in there as well?
I think that's the big ones. I do like the picture that you have there of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson praying. I think that's a big thing that the South had early on, and even up until the end, until we get to Sherman marching through the South. I think they felt like they had a just cause, and that's going to lead further into history later on in the future of that lost cause syndrome that the South has. But yeah, I like that picture because they're praying, obviously, and they feel like they have God on their side, and they feel like they're right. Even so much so is like they harken back to the Revolutionary War. They feel like this is the second revolution, even though we call the War of 1812 the second revolution. They look at this as a second revolution. So I like that picture.
And we don't want to overlook the culture of honor in the South as well, as
Right,
because
right,
for many Southern white men, it really didn't seem like fighting this war was in their best interests, economically or for
right,
any reason really, but yet they still did it because of the sectionalism and the beliefs the Southerners had in their states, in their homes, in their families, and they felt, like you said before, they had more of a cause, more of a reason to fight. They felt that they were slightly being abused. All right, moving on. We're going to jump past the conscription and draft riots and just jump straight into the war. And it's going to start with Fort Sumter. Give us a little bit of detail on Fort Sumter.
Well, Fort Sumter was a federal, we'll call it a federal fort in the port of Charleston that was designed to keep. Actually, it was built during the War of 1812 to keep the British out of Charleston. Charleston was the big shipping port for the South, and if you look at the map in the upper right-hand corner, you see us surrounding forts that were built really just to protect Charleston and Charleston Harbor. And basically, what it boiled down to was that the Confederates had captured all of the forts around Fort Sumter, and the commander in Fort Sumter had moved all of the Union soldiers or all the Federal soldiers into Fort Sumter, and they basically held out, and they held out, and they held out, and they held out, completely surrounded by the Confederates, and they thought that President Lincoln was going to send them a reinforcement ship so that they could either escape or to get more ammunition and fight back. But Lincoln didn't do that. He didn't send it because he knew that if he did, the war would inevitably start. He felt like if he could just hold out for a little bit longer and hold out for just a little bit longer and longer and longer, that maybe the Confederates would lose their cause and surrender the other forts. But he pretty much said, sorry, Fort Sumter, you're on your own. It kind of, here's another future analogy. It's a little bit like John F. Kennedy with the Bay of Pigs. He had the opportunity to send planes to the Bay of Pigs and he didn't. It's the same thing with Lincoln. Um, he held out, trying to think that if they did supply, that the war would start immediately, and if he could just keep Fort Sumter under wraps, and maybe even just lose Fort Sumter, the Confederates would still kind of lose their fervor and quit. But in the end, the commander in Fort Sumter, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but the commander in Fort Sumter ultimately
I don't need to know the names and the places anymore.
But But he ultimately had to surrender the fort, and so basically this is the first time that the Confederacy or the Confederate States, well, they weren't the Confederate States at the time, but the first time South Carolina had physically done something to the federal government that made the federal government respond. And so that's why they call that the first battle of the Civil War.
We could also draw an analogy to modern times with our president today, Barack Obama, kind of following Lincoln in that similar action of trying to avoid war, avoid conflict with ISIS right now in the Middle East.
Right.
Our president tried to do just about everything possible without having to use any physical force, and he's still really only limiting our attacks in the Middle East right now, once again, to just airstrikes, because he doesn't want to get bogged down into another war, trying to do, basically anything he can. Same thing with Lincoln, just trying to hold on, but eventually, well, we saw what happened. We'll see what happens with the Civil War. Maybe we'll see what happens with a possible Civil War in the Middle East.
Right.
Moving past Fort Sumter, and often students will say, well, why don't they just let the South leave? Well, there's a lot of economic reasons, but
where'd you go?
One of the easiest Union forts all throughout the South, and all these forts are, where did they go? All these forts are going to be taken over by the Confederates. All the weapons, all the munitions, all of that is going to be basically stolen from America, which you can't really just let happen. Although Lincoln is trying to just kind of wait things out, but that's probably the easiest explanation to a student when they ask, well, just let them start their own country. Well, you're giving up a lot of stuff when you do that. You really don't want to make that decision. So breaking down now that the North or the Union or the Blues, whichever you want to call them, are going to have to basically fight this war, let's look at the strategy, the Winfield Scott's Great Snake Plan.
Right.
Break that down for me, Mr.
Okay,
B.
so the idea was, because the South had such deep ties to shipping through Charleston, through ports in Texas, through ports in Alabama and Mississippi, he planned, because the federal government and the national government, or the Union government at this point now, has a better Navy, he thought that they could create a blockade. And a blockade would basically be like a wall of ships that surrounded the South. As your map shows, it would surround the South and keep them from being able to get foreign assistance and get their cotton out. That's the thing too, is the South's going to have to rely on growing the cotton and getting it shipped to other countries so that they can make money. And if Lincoln and the federal government and the Union Navy can keep the cotton in the South and keep them from getting that money, then they can't buy the things they need, because they can't produce it. They can't produce the goods that they need, so they're going to have to buy it. And how are they going to buy it? They're going to sell their cotton and then buy the goods. So Winfield Scott creates this Anaconda plan, where he was going to surround the South by the Union Navy, with the Union Navy, and then eventually tighten the South, or tighten the hold around the South through land victories, and basically smother the South from all points to keep them from being able to form their own country.
And this is similar to the British strategy during the War of 1812. The British tried basically the same thing, and did an okay job at it, had they kind of not just decided to move on with their lives.
Right. And I think that's ultimately where Winfield Scott got his plan, was the War of 1812, because he thought that he fought in that battle, or excuse me, that war, and so that's where he got that plan, was from the War of 1812.
Well, and this idea of blockades and economic sanctions is a pattern that we still see a lot today. Obviously, as you were talking about with Cuba, that would be one of our ways that we fight the war with Cuba, as opposed to just going straight against the Soviet Cubans. connection. We fight more economic today, well, with Russia over the last year.
Iran.
Russia taking over, and Iran doing things that we don't really like. We place lots of economic sanctions on them. We don't sell them things. We don't give them opportunities to buy and sell with other countries. All sorts of, I can't even. I wouldn't even really know the exact economic sanctions we have on Russia, other than we don't loan them as much money. We stop them from selling and buying certain American goods. I don't even know what ones I could break down.
I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'm stuck in the past, so I don't know.
It's much easier. These are much easier to understand because there's a literal ship blocking goods from coming in and out. Today, we don't necessarily physically, literally stand on the border of Russia and say, you can't sell goods this way or you can't come in here. It's much more complicated. Maybe that's why we don't study this stuff.
That's true. Well, we will in 50 years when we're done teaching.
Yeah, but it'll be back. It will come back.
Yeah.
So let's go to the first battle then.
Sure.
One thing to understand is, as you pointed out with the Anaconda Plan, is the North is going to have to be on the offensive. The North will have to force the South to come back. The South doesn't necessarily have to be offensive, although they will be eventually. But originally, when we look at this war, the aggressor is going to be the Union.
Right. And their problem is too is that the Confederacy is so close. I read once a statistic where there were more battles fought in like a 300 square mile range around D.C. and Richmond than any other physical space in all of the Civil War. Because you've got to think Richmond, Virginia, which is the Confederate capital, becomes a Confederate capital, and Washington, D.C. are only 100 miles apart. And today that doesn't seem like a long time or very far, and it wasn't even back then. People did it in a day's ride. And so those capitals are so close that most of the battles are going to be in that area. And the first one is Bull Run. It's also sometimes called the Battle of Manassas, depending on which side of the war you're on. But the Battle of Bull Run or the Battle of Manassas Creek or Manassas Juncture was the interesting thing that I always think about with this is that people packed a lunch. Washington socialites packed a lunch and set up on a hill to watch the battle. They looked at this as a picnic, and the whole country thought that this war was going to be a 90-day frolic almost. I mean, they thought that it was just going to be done in 90 days, and so they thought that they had better go look at the battles and watch the battles that they could as a spectator. I mean, it's almost like they sold tickets. But it happened on a Sunday, so that they were all out in their best dresses, and they packed lunches. They walked out. They thought that the two armies would line up. They would fight their battle. They thought that the Confederates would run, and the war would be over. But that's not how it went. That's not how it fought out. The battle was a Confederate victory from the get-go. The Union generals didn't know where the Confederate troops were. The Confederate troops knew better where the Union soldiers were. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. You're cut out there for a second. Go ahead.
Okay, so they ultimately initially the Union did fight better. And they actually had the Confederates on the run, but then the Confederate, some more experienced generals like Stonewall Jackson or like Thomas Jonathan Jackson, we should call him first. Thomas Jonathan Jackson there in your bottom right corner, his troops stand. They make a stand, and there's a couple different legends about how he gets his name, but ultimately they come up with the name Stonewall Jackson. And Stonewall Jackson carries that name until he dies later on in the war. But his troops stand, and they make the stand, and then as soon as they do, the Union advance just crumbles. They don't know which way is which. They're not used. They weren't expecting the South to actually fight, and so that's the big highlight of Bull Run. You've got people thinking that the war is going to be over in 30 days. They need to go watch what they can, and then the North feeling like they have an advantage, but the South ultimately standing and fighting and making a stand and making a stand like a stone wall, and they're able to fight back the Union. Also, a thing of note with the Battle of Bull Run was that this is one of the first times that, at least on in the what we'll call the modern era, or the modern warfare, where troops got to a battlefield by something other than their feet or horse. The Confederates brought up troops from further south in Virginia on trains, and that was a major victory for the South, because they were able to get more troops to the battlefield quicker using trains. So that's the Battle of Bull Run, pretty well summed up.
And two things to go big picture for some of our students who may have read in Field Strategy and Techniques. You can always read some of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which is basically just a advice, a self-help book almost for generals. And in one of the tidbits that he gives, and we'll discuss some more of this a little bit later, but one set of advice that is given is prepare for a long war. Never expect a short war. And for any country who goes in thinking this is going to be easy, it almost always blows up in your face. Here is the Union thinking this will be easy. We'll take them out in 90 days. It'll be over. They're not prepared for a long war. Whereas the South is prepared for a long war. They're prepared to fight. When the short war doesn't happen, morale in the North will drop. Same thing with Vietnam. Same thing with a lot of other battles. Iraq today. Afghanistan, when we believe that we're going to go in and fix this and it'll all be done, and then when that doesn't happen, you lose the hearts and the minds of the people who supported the war, of our nation and the nation involved, and then you also lose the hearts and the souls and the minds of the soldiers. Right. Also, the next thing that I want to add is, if you're on my website, socialstudiesgames.us, and you're looking at these PowerPoints, you can click on any of the blue links, and you can see battles on YouTube, reenactments. And there's a lot of really good Civil War movies, and there's basically every battle, I believe, except for Vicksburg. Vicksburg's the only one you can't find a YouTube video of. But other than that, everything that we talk about, you can watch a video and see a film depiction of these battles. So definitely check that out. Or just Google Bull Run on YouTube, or if you're from the South, Manassas. Type in. Anyway, moving on. So if you've got a scoreboard at home and you're keeping track of who's winning, who's losing, right now I would say that the Confederates or the South or the Grays are leading in the first quarter. Would you agree, Mr.
I would say probably smashingly winning in the first quarter.
Yeah, they return the opening kickoff, and they've got the ball back again, and they're looking to score again. And we'll move on to the second battle of Bull Run.
And that's basically the same thing. They come back a couple days later trying to do the same thing, trying to shake one of the their opponent. They're trying to shake their opponent off of the field to try to get close to the capital. That's the other big thing I think you really need to think about is that they're trying to get close to the other one's capital, because that was the warfare at the time, was if you captured your opponent's capital, then you won. And so they're trying, each army is trying to block their capital, at the same time try to take their opponent's capital. And so they come back a couple days later and they smash up again, and the same thing happens. The Union gets on the offensive, and the South just pretty much sits and waits for them. They fight them off, and then when the Union freaks out and panics because they didn't win right away, the South kind of comes in and takes all kinds of prisoners, and then they quit. That's the thing about the second Bull Run, is they quit. They just stop. Both armies pretty much stop, and they say, okay, we've got to reconsider how we're going to fight this war.
All right, so let's jump forward and go into Antietam, which I believe will happen because of, I guess, spying. Robert E. Lee's strategy was wrapped around the cigar, I believe, and
right.
The Union soldiers found out about where he was going to be, and that's going to lead to the Battle of Antietam. And things are going to slightly, I guess you're going to say that the North is going to come back a little, but I mean, you could argue really what happens here. Explain Antietam. to the crowd.
Sure. Well, like you said, the spying took place. Robert E. Lee's battle plans were dropped in a cigar case that was being carried by a courier from Lee to, I believe, Stonewall Jackson. Um, but ultimately, the North finds out where they are. The problem with the North, though, is that they have General McClellan, General George B. McClellan, who has what Abraham Lincoln called the slows. And McClellan is always too cautious to move exactly where he needs to be. He knows where he needs to be, but he doesn't move exactly where they're supposed to be in the speed that he should. That's the thing, is the speed. He knew he needed to be at point B, but he never really did leave point A because he was too afraid. He was too scared. And that's where the South and the generals of the South take advantage of the North, is because they'll move to point B and then move to point C because they know that's where they need to be. And they'll do it with speed. And so Antietam comes about. Again, they smash mouth. Antietam's a very bloody battle. And ultimately, again, the North takes a beating because they just don't have the aggressive generals. They don't have the aggressive fighters. The South has aggressive fighters. They have more skilled generals, or not necessarily more skilled, but more aggressive, more courageous fighters themselves. And so Antietam is a bloodbath. The North pretty much they draw it to even. I think most historians will say it was a Confederate victory, but if you look at the numbers, it was pretty evenly bad for both sides. But Antietam again is a big battle it's a big victory basically for the South, though. And that's the big things that you can take away from the battle itself.
You could also argue that this is not necessarily, I wouldn't go as far to say it's a victory for the South. I would say in the long scheme of things, kind of, but kind of not, because Antietam, I mean, if you were to argue, when all said and done, did Antietam work out more beneficial for the North or the South? I would say probably the North.
Right. In that, I don't know where I don't want to steal your thunder. What point are you going to make with that?
Well, the couple points. Obviously, after the battle, Union is going. I mean, Lee will retreat. He doesn't really retreat as we lost, but retreats as you only have two directions to go after a battle. You can either push forward or go back. And following that, I guess the image that's displayed is Europe thinks, we're not really going to get involved in this.
Right.
They had to have a definitive win there for the European nations, mainly England, to support the South. They don't get that definitive win, and Europe decides, hey, we're going to stay out of this. We're not really going to get involved in the Civil War.
Right, and I think you bring up a point about Robert E. Lee moving away from the battlefield, and at that time, that meant that you lost. Now, the people who defend Robert E. Lee's actions say that he moved away so that he wouldn't lose any more troops. It's the bloodiest battle, bloodiest single day in the whole war. And so he realizes, oh, shoot, and this goes back to the first slide that you had, the North is going to have the stuff that they need. And when I say stuff, I mean troops, uniforms, guns, cannons, ammunition. They have the stuff. Robert E. Lee has the fighters, the skill, the courage, but he knows that if he loses those things, he can't replace them. If the North loses a cannon, they can replace it. If the South loses a general, they can't replace him. So he moves away from the battlefield, considering that factor. He has to realize, okay, we're going to get beat if we keep this up. We're not going to be able to sustain the war if we keep this up. If we keep smashing heads against each other, we're going to lose. And so he moves away with the idea of, okay, fine, I smashed your mouth, you smashed my mouth, but I'm going to move away so I can fight another day. And that ultimately cost him what many people call the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg. Again, this is a north-south thing. You're going to call it Antietam. I'm going to call it Sharpsburg. But, that's neither here nor there.
And another important point to make is that McClellan will not follow Lee, and probably for, one, as you've decided earlier, that he has a case of the slows, as Lincoln would have said, but also for the same reason that Lee retreated, basically kind of saving his people. It's a very bloody battle, bloody war. Even though, like you said, though, the North probably could have replaced any of the losses that they make. So he could have followed Lee and possibly ended the war right then and there pretty early into the war, but he does not follow, and that will cost him his job, and that will lead to the Civil War continuing. Also, which we'll talk about in another video, is that after this, I guess, semi-quasi supposed victory by the North, Lincoln will use that sort of as political capital or political power so that he can pass the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, we'll dive into the Civil War, but this is the moment where the Emancipation Proclamation will be pushed forward. Anything else you want to add about Antietam?
No, I'm glad you brought up the Emancipation Proclamation because that's what he does. It's not a battlefield victory, but it's a political victory, and he realizes he can do that.
So the next really big war on our, and you can see the visuals, McClellan does not follow, so McClellan gets fired. But that's not the last of McClellan. Europe decides, as you can see in the visual, they're not going to help out. All right, going on to Fredericksburg.
Fredericksburg. Now, Fredericksburg, actually, there's a lot of interesting history around Fredericksburg. You have a lot of
our next.
I'm sorry. What?
You're cutting in and out on me.
I know. You keep cutting in and out too. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The Battle of Fredericksburg will be fought in December of 1862, I believe,
right.
And basically another loss for the Union. If you're keeping track on the scoreboard, really not a definitive. I mean, you have to remember there were a lot of battles still going on that we're not even talking about. There's tons of conflicts, armed conflicts going on that we're not really talking about. But when we're talking about these major battles, we've really yet to say definitively the North has won a battle.
No.
And this is going to be another example of, as you explained, that region of Virginia where it just seems like it's constant fighting. Once again, the Confederates will win, and another Union general will be fired. Often, when I think of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, I think of a general manager of a sports team, like a Jerry Jones firing his coach every season, or George Steinbrenner in the 80s for the Yankees firing his coaches. That's kind of how I feel.
Donald Trump, even. Donald Trump, you didn't perform, you're fired. You know. And I understand. Yeah, that's a good. And here you see, I like your visual. That's Ambrose Burnside, who comes up with the fashionable sideburns. There's just a little random history for you. But yeah, Fredericksburg, it's a big battle. It's on a micro level. This is an interesting piece that you have for the first time Irish soldiers on both sides of the army fighting each other directly, and that's a big thing. They square up. People who were from the same villages in Ireland squared up on opposite sides of the Civil War, and that you see that most at the Fredericksburg with the charging of Marie's Heights. The Irish Brigade was on the top for the Confederates, and the Irish Brigades were on the bottom with the Union, and they charged and charged and charged, and the Confederates basically stood behind a wall, and they would have one man shooting, two men loading the rifles, and they just murdered. I mean, it was a slaughter. That's the micro level there that you see for the first time, like just charge after charge after charge of people trying to take a position that ultimately had no benefit for anybody, but they charged and charged and charged, and that's kind of why Fredericksburg was a loss for the North. In my book, Fredericksburg was a loss for the North.
Yeah, I believe I'm going to follow your book for that as well. The next thing, maybe this could possibly pop up on a test, which in the grand scheme of things, I would say the naval warfare, not really that important, the Merrimack and the Monitor, but knowing that, at least here in North Carolina, technology and innovation is part of, are part of the standards in North Carolina, you could possibly see this. I mean, this leads to the modern warfare we have today, where we have ironclad boats, and this would be the first real battle between them. And no one really wins, I believe. It's basically a draw.
Right.
And Well, that's that. I could possibly see this, though, of all things, popping up on a test.
Oh, sure, because it's technology. For the first time, two ships not made of wood attacked each other, and that's the first in naval warfare. And it's a pretty big. It's a pretty. I mean, it's actually a pretty interesting battle if you want to get down on the micro level of things and how each of these ships were built and the different technologies that they used and the different strategies and that they were built on. But as far as for our test and stuff like that, it's probably not. It'll show up because it's the first use of ships not made of wood, and other than that, it's really it's interesting, but it probably won't show up on the test. Now you could say you could draw that. You see the I can't even remember which one it is, but the ship on the game there that you have, the design, the sloped sides, they've actually started going and making ships now with that for a radar deflection. But other than that, it's kind of a blip in the Civil War history, but it's actually pretty interesting when you get down on the micro level. We just won't focus on that, really, will we?
Well, the one thing I do want to talk about, I guess we're spending time on the Monitor and Merrimack, which is crazy, but I do like to think of it from the terms of just being inquisitive and going back to those basic ideas, even childlike ideas of when boats were built, they chose wood because wood floats, and so that makes sense. And you know though that steel doesn't float, that'll sink. And so from those basic ideas, that's kind of what leads to innovation. The real reason that the boat floats is because of its buoyancy and design. It's not necessarily because it uses wood. But sometimes we get trapped into those ideas.
Right.
Eventually, people can overcome those. Often at times we think we know everything, and that's what prevents us from actually questioning our understanding, questioning our learning. Someone obviously said, you know what? No, it's not. The wood is not what's making it float. It's the way that we've designed the ships is what makes it float. So we can do that same thing with steel, but it took someone to, reset our brains and reset our minds. That's why I think the Merrimack and the Monitor are kind of interesting things to say. Same thing with the battles, though. We have to make sure that we challenge our own beliefs and we start to look at things differently.
I agree. Okay.
So going back to Scott's plans, you see that the big part was the blockade on the East Coast, but also a part of that was taking control of the Mississippi River. And this is the part of the story where the tides are going to slowly turn and the North will win because of one of the few adequate generals that North has will actually get something done. And that's all going to start along the Mississippi River, correct?
Of course, you're going to bring that up, but okay, we'll talk about it. You being from the North, and I'm not. So, sure, we'll talk about the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River is where the Union shines. They actually kick butt. They kick butt and take names in the West, where the North has inadequate generals in the East, up around Virginia and D.C. and all that area. The North has some very aggressive generals in the West, and that's where they start to actually shine. And that actually, some people argue that it wasn't a strategic plan. They didn't say, oh yeah, we're going to fight in the West, we're going to win in the West and lose in the East. But after it was over, they were kind of like, oh yeah, that was our plan to begin with. It's kind of after you win, you say, yeah, I meant to do that. But that's how it worked in the West. You have Ulysses S. Grant. I know you'll probably get to him more, but Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman fighting out West, and that's where they start to actually win the Civil War.
So the first thing that's not in our notes at socialstudiesgames.us, bing, there's the Battle of New Orleans. Not in the notes, but that's a big strategic victory to shut down the port of New Orleans. But really what we will focus on, I guess, would be the Battle of Shiloh is going to be the first real, all right, who's this Grant guy? Kind of like, if you're looking at sports, this is like your team's losing, and all of a sudden this one guy has this really good game, and everybody's like, we're all hearing about.
Right. And he comes in the second quarter. He comes in. He's the ringer that they bring in the second quarter, and then he's going to play the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter. but yeah, he's the ringer. Grant, relatively obscure person at the beginning of the Civil War. He actually joined the Union Army as a private, and through some political connections that he had, he he kept getting bumped up in rank. But at the Battle of Shiloh, he uses this is where the North had their technological advantage. They had more ships that could run up and down the Mississippi River. They could get troops up and down the Mississippi River where they needed to be quicker. And then at Shiloh, not quite as much river-based fighting, but at Shiloh, Grant just realizes, and Grant's the first person to capitalize on this. He realizes, okay, we have the advantage of stuff. We have the things that we need to win this war. We have soldiers, we have weapons, we have horses, we have uniforms, we have all the stuff. And so he basically just goes out and just stands there and lets the Confederacy punch him. And then when the Confederacy's tired out, he knocks them down with one blow. And that's what Shiloh is. It's an extremely bloody battle. The Confederacy at this time, the Confederacy is the one charging and charging and charging and charging, and Grant just kind of stands there and has his troops stand and fight, and ultimately wears the Confederacy down. It's a little bit like Muhammad Ali. Since you're such a boxing, or since we're boxing fans too, it's Muhammad Ali. He would let the other guy punch him and punch him and punch him and punch him, and then in the the last round he comes in and knocks him down in one blow. That's what Grant does at Shiloh.
Uh-oh. We lost you for a second. Go ahead and say that again.
I'm sorry. Which part? The Muhammad Ali?
Yes.
Okay, so what Muhammad Ali would do is he would take his lumps in the early rounds, and he would just basically get his nose bloodied every round for 15, 16 rounds, and then in the last round he comes in with a sudden burst of energy and knocks the guy down with one or two powerful blows, and that's what Grant does. He pretty much just says, okay, South, come and fight me. I can replace anything that you take from me. You can't replace what I take from you. And so Grant wins Shiloh pretty handedly in that regard.
So then we'll move on to Vicksburg, which really is, when we look at the Civil War and we look at probably the two biggest battles, we're probably going to say Vicksburg and then Gettysburg, which we'll talk about next. This is probably the critical moment, I don't know if I want to say the climax of the movie, but it's definitely crucial to the war. From here, everything will change. Vicksburg is located along the Mississippi River. This is basically once again to go back to Winfield Scott's plan of surrounding the South and then also cutting them in half. This is it. This is the final piece of the puzzle. If the Union can take Vicksburg, they now have control of the Mississippi River, which basically means, as far as supplies go, the South will have a hard time replenishing itself, and the North will easily be able to send in troops, send in stuff, as we now affectionately have been referring to it as.
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about Vicksburg.
Well, and I think one of the reasons that you can't find a video for the reenactment of Vicksburg is because it was a siege, and it's kind of hard to recreate a siege in modern time without actually doing it. But the Union Navy surrounds Vicksburg. Vicksburg is built. It's kind of a hard thing to imagine, but Vicksburg is built on a hill where it's surrounded. It's almost a peninsula. It's surrounded on three sides by the Mississippi River, and so basically the North surrounds Vicksburg.
I guess to give our students a good visual, because like you said, Vicksburg, they didn't, and I don't know why. I understand in terms of reenactment, but in terms of films or movies, they should do something. But if you're trying to visualize Vicksburg, I would think of it, if you've seen any of the Lord of the Ring movies or any of these like fantasy movies where they have like these castles on the mountains.
Right.
That's kind of what Vicksburg is. It's not a castle on a mountain, but it's like this city on top of a hill surrounded by water. It's almost, it's pretty fantastical, I guess.
Oh, sure. And that's I guess I've missed your point there about the movies. Yeah, you're right. It'd be hard to recreate that for simple geography. Maybe with some CGI, when that gets, when CGI really takes off, that might be something somebody can do. I don't know why they haven't yet, but they surround
Transformers 4,
Transformers 4.
Vicksburg.
So they surround him on water. Admiral David Farragut from Tennessee. Also, he surrounds Vicksburg by sea, and then Sherman and Grant surround by land. And they basically, I mean, the people of Vicksburg are reduced to eating horses, mules, rats, anything that they can get, because they're so choked out. They're so connected to the outside world that they can't even get their own food in, and so they're reduced to eating what they end up having left, which is, if a horse dies, they eat the horse. If a mule dies, they eat the mule, and it turns into a point where the Confederacy just can't hang on, and so at the end of the day, Grant comes in and says, okay, you're going to surrender. You're going to have to surrender. There's nothing else that you can do, and I will take nothing but unconditional surrender from you. And so U.S. Grant turns into, his nickname then becomes Unconditional Surrender Grant. And that's the micro level details for Vicksburg. Do you want to hit the big stuff?
Just one point I want to make before we do that is, often when we get into the middle of this war, and it's easy for us to say us versus them or North versus South, but really this is America versus America. This is a civil war, and we can't emphasize the point enough that, look, you have Americans fighting Americans. We have Americans starving to death in a city eating dogs while other Americans are shooting at them. It's very hard for us today to empathize or really realize what that must have been like. Yes, there are civil wars going on in other countries at the time, right now, but it's hard for us as Americans to really understand what's like, especially for myself as a Northerner, and to have grown up hearing one side of the Civil War. Maybe yourself as a Southerner may have a little bit of understanding based on what you've been told from your ancestors and have a better. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, you might know what it's like to eat a dog. I don't know what it's like. No, I shouldn't be joking around about this.
Well, you put a little bit of hot sauce on the dog, and it tastes pretty good. Well, okay. So back to the video and the seriousness of it. You bring up the good point of Americans versus Americans. You see that in the general ranks of the North and the South. These men fought together in the Mexican-American War, and then you're going to find themselves on opposite sides of the Civil War, and that a big thing has to do with the education that they received at West Point. Like Ulysses S. Grant, a prime example, fought alongside James Longstreet, who he's going to end up ultimately fighting against in the Civil War. And to beat it all, Robert E. Lee was the commandant of West Point when all of these guys were there. So he was the principal, so to speak, of the school that these men were educated in. He's the president of the university. And so he's going to know all of them. He's going to know almost every single general during the Civil War came through West Point at a time when Robert E. Lee was the commander of West Point. And so you're right. It's Americans versus Americans. These men had fought and died with each other in the Mexican-American War, and then they're going to find themselves on opposite sides of the Civil War.
Big picture on Vicksburg. What do you think?
Big picture on Vicksburg. Just that this is kind of the last great hope of the South to be able to get that cotton out to other countries, and be able to buy what they need, buy the stuff of war, so to speak. Vicksburg was the last chance. They thought if they could hold Vicksburg, they might be able to sneak past New Orleans and sneak past Baton Rouge, but that's just not going to happen. So that's the big picture.
And another big point about the cotton that we didn't talk about earlier, the European nations, mainly Britain, they didn't necessarily decide that they weren't going to support the South based on the Battle of Antietam, or necessarily because they didn't want to get involved in picking sides. But one, they had basically saw this coming like everyone else in the war, and in the world, and had built up a large supply of cotton. And they also, some of our other students from the past who've studied world history know that India will soon become one of their main sources for cotton. So
Right.
things just aren't going the way of the South. And really, when we know the strengths and weaknesses, that this is what was supposed to happen, but it's just taken a while to get to this point, mainly because of the strengths of the South. But eventually, the more stuff thing is gonna
Right.
decide. It's just like today when you have teams with the New York Yankees they just are stronger. They have more resources. It's just the way it is. The team with more stuff, 9 times out of 10, is going to win.
Right.
And
Right.
so that will take us to really the beginning of the end, which will be the Battle of Gettysburg, which is fought in the North.
For the
There
first.
were plenty, yeah, there were other battles in the North, but you should make note that everything that we've talked about to this point have been battles fought in the South. Now we're going to make a shift to a battle in the North.
Right. Right. And Gettysburg was
And
actually.
there's .org. You can find.
Oh. Uh-oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, Gettysburg was actually the third or fourth time. It's the furthest that the Confederacy had invaded into the North. They every spring they would go further and further into the North, but Gettysburg is the furthest they'd ever got. And going back to the stuff issue, Gettysburg was a target because it had stores of stuff that the Confederates needed. So they said, "Ooh, there's a lot of stuff here in Gettysburg that we need: shoes, clothes, food. We're going to attack Gettysburg to try to get to that stuff." And basically what they did was they ran smack into the whole Union Army. Basically in the east, they ran right into them. And for 3 days, the Confederacy tried to make the North budge from Gettysburg, and it didn't work. They actually had the advantage, the geographic advantage, but instead of turning to get the stuff, to get the things that they needed, they actually turned to fight the North, and that's what precipitated the battle, was them turning to the North to fight and then not getting the stuff that they needed. And so Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. It's span over 3 days, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of, oh gosh, the year just left me.
1863.
1863, thank you. And this is what's called the high water mark of the Civil War. You have a picture there in your visual there in the upper right hand corner of Pickett's charge. The man there with his hat is Let me back up. The man there with his hat stuffed on his sword is Louis Armstead, and he was the commander of the troops that made it the furthest north during the furthest to the north and during Pickett's charge. And this was the battle. This was the high water mark of the Confederacy.
Another point to make about during this battle is, and I know you said that the Confederates had an advantage, but during Pickett's charge, the North had the advantage of the high ground, correct?
Right.
And going back to Sun Tzu and the Art of War, students often say, well, why is high ground such an important thing? Well, let's break it down. If you have the high ground, first of all, you have a better visual. You can see all around you. You can see in any direction, basically. You can see further away. So from a scouting perspective, seeing and knowing first is important. You can see what's coming early on. 2, going up a hill as opposed to going down a hill, you move slower. And,
right.
And another point is you tire out faster going up a hill as opposed to downhill. And this also applies to not just humans, but when we're talking about horses, we're talking about moving artillery. So being on top is a very important strategic advantage. Even today, if you look at our battles in Afghanistan, a lot of the problems that our soldiers endure each day is that terrorists, snipers take high ground, hide in caves, and attack from high ground, sniping our soldiers, unfortunately, today. And same logic applies now. And like tanks, you're not going to take a tank. Well, you can in some circumstances up a mountain, but it's still difficult. So those are just some of the ideas of why higher ground is important. If you've ever played King of the Hill, as a kid. I don't know. Did you ever play King of the Hill?
Oh,
Mr. B?
sure, yeah, yeah. We had plenty of hills to play it on in the South. Um,
When you're on the top, it's much easier. When someone has to run all the way up the hill to try to knock you down, they're the one running up the hill. They wear themselves out. It's harder to get grounding, and you just kind of give them a quick shove, and then they roll all the way back down the hill.
right, and now you're talking about interesting battlefield movement. There's been some theories out about this, that there was a fence in the middle of Pickett's charge that ran
Hmm.
along the road, and the order was to climb over the fence. And they said that had they not climbed over the fence, if they simply knocked the fence down, this is battlefield movement. This is like micro level. But if they'd knocked the fence down, it would have not stopped the movement, or oh gosh, what's the word? I just lost it.
Momentum.
The momentum of the Confederacy. They would have not lost that momentum, and that they could have potentially gotten to the Union lines much faster and much stronger than had they then having crawled over the top. But that's micro, super duper history nerdy kind of thing to think about.
Well, to explain that a little more clearly, because I mean I get what you're saying, but basically you're saying that when they jump over the fence, then it's one by one they kind of funnel over the fence and then towards the Union
Right.
lines.
Right.
Had they just knocked the fence down, then they could have all rushed together one major line, but they
Right.
didn't do that because they were kind of just hopping over the fence one by one, and it made it much easier for the Union to slowly pick them off one by one, as opposed to dealing with just one tidal wave of gray soldiers.
Right. Right.
But that didn't happen.
It happened. Yeah, I mean, shoulda, coulda, woulda. Yeah, looking back 150 years later, yeah, it'd have been easier. Just knock the
Now,
fence over.
I do want to make a point that when we talk about the Confederates or the South, and maybe possibly are rooting for them in some senses, we are by no means defending slavery or bondage whatsoever. We're just thinking of things from a military standpoint. So when we rethink that, please do not misconstrue us as saying we are rooting for pro-slavery team. And I know, Mr. B, I don't want to get into the complexities of the Civil War in this discussion, but I just wanted to make sure that that was stated, because some students and some people watching the videos that leave comments may say, listen to these guys. Anyway, all right, so let's jump on down to really from Gettysburg. That is the beginning of the end, and we'll talk about the Gettysburg Address in a political view of the Civil War, but not in this. This is our military battle video, and for those of you that are still with us, thank you. I know it's been a little longer than our originally intended 20 minutes, but we're getting the details. Obviously, my favorite, and probably your most antagonistic. You're the villain. Hero for me, villain for you, William Tecumseh Sherman, former, well, I won't say former, but a general from the great state of Ohio, Lancaster, Ohio, if you're keeping score at home. Tell me your point of view on Mr. Sherman.
Well, I had a professor in college who referred to Sherman as blank blank Sherman, and I will say that the first word or first letter of the first word was G, and the second letter.
Here, Mr. B.
I'm sorry.
I want you to repeat that because you cut out, and
Okay.
I want our audience to know your real true views on William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, no, he was not Native American. He was named Tecumseh because when he was born, he had bright red hair, which looked like Tecumseh. So go ahead.
Okay, so I was saying that I had a professor in college who was from Columbia, South Carolina, and actually from Charleston, South Carolina, who referred to Sherman as G.D. Sherman. Now, I won't repeat those words, but every time he referred to Sherman, he referred to him as G.D. Sherman. And the story behind that was that his family was afraid that Sherman would get his silver, the family's silver, and so they sent it to. Oh gosh. Okay. How about now?
Okay, keep going. It's fine.
Okay. Have we got enough to edit out?
The ghost of William's computer.
Okay, so yeah, he's attacking my computer. But they sent their family silver away from Charleston to Columbia, and ultimately Sherman went to Columbia instead of Charleston, and so his reference was, some private from Wisconsin's got my family's silver thanks to G.D. Sherman. But yeah, Sherman, what he did was he ended the Civil War faster. He cuts through the South, cuts through, burns all the stuff that he can possibly burn.
Again,
Uh oh, what am I needing to do?
that's all right. Just keep
Okay,
going.
so he cuts through the South and um, burns up anything that he needs to burn up. Basically, burns up anything that he sees, and this ultimately cripples the South. They suddenly become more worried about what's going on at home. Troops won't fight as hard on the field if they're worried about somebody burning their crops at home. And so that really cost the South in the East, and it takes away that fighting spirit that they had at the beginning of the war.
This will be really one of the first times total war will be implemented as a strategy. We still will see battles where troops match up against each other, but now we're getting to the point where there really aren't any rules. You can do whatever you want. The objective is to hurt your opponent, and the best way to hurt your opponent is to damage them not just on the battlefield, not just economically, but also psychologically. And so Sherman basically destroy everything. And so that's probably why when you hear Mr. B talk, he and many Southerners do not like William Tecumseh Sherman because he ruined lives pretty much.
Oh yeah.
Does the end justify the means?
No.
Probably, I think so.
No, it doesn't, because it sets the South behind for until now, for 150 years.
Yeah, and you can look at some of the images you see there on our screen, but everything was destroyed, and all of that will have to be rebuilt. Whereas in the North, everything is fine and dandy, and that's not going to happen. So if you're imagining the growth of America as a foot race, this is almost as if
the North is tripping the South. That's what it's doing.
If you're on my website, you can read some really great quotes by Mr. Sherman. So I'm going to read some of these because it allows me the ability to almost curse a little bit here. It is only those who have neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud for blood. More vengeance, more desolation. War is hell. War is cruelty. There's no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. And then once again by Mr. Sherman. You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. So those quotes by Mr. Sherman pretty much reveal his intentions and what he will later on do during his march to the sea. Kind of the perfect guy for the job, I guess, if you were asking me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, kudos for the North for picking William Tecumseh Sherman. If they had sent I'd have been like, well, let's don't burn this, or, well, you know, those folks, they're trying real hard. But yeah, Sherman just said, burn it. He said, screw it, just burn everything. Destroy anything that you can possibly destroy.
And you know, this will basically mark the end of the war. Well, it'll slowly wind down. But another important part of this was, in the North, people really were not really sold on the war. This is, you know, we're already 3 years in. It's dragging on. People are not excited about the war anymore. They're, you know, considering allowing the Confederacy to come back. McClellan is running against Lincoln, and Lincoln actually thinks he's going to lose the election. Had it not been for William Tecumseh Sherman basically blowing the South up, Lincoln could have possibly lost the re-election. What do you think?
Oh yeah, easily. Lincoln sweated every bit of the election of 1864. I think I've never read a direct quote about that, but I think in the long run, Lincoln realized that was the toughest political battle that he had ever fought, because McClellan, though he was a terrible general, was extremely popular. He represented the people who said, and McClellan came out and said, you know, if I win, we're going to start immediately reconciling with the South and looking for maneuvers to maybe end the war with them, either as their own country or together again. And Lincoln keeps saying, no, we've got to win the war. We have to preserve the Union. And McClellan was extremely popular, even, like I said, even though he was a terrible general. He, you know, really does throw Lincoln a hard battle during the political campaign.
I know some people are going to look at the map of the Electoral College and say, well, look, Lincoln didn't have to worry. He got 212 points to McClellan's 21. But if you look at the popular vote, although the popular vote doesn't mean anything, but it will reveal that the country was pretty split evenly. Lincoln still won handedly, but there were a lot of people who were behind McClellan. Enough so that, you take Sherman away, I think McClellan wins this election
I think so too.
very easily, and then the South comes, the whole history changes. So you got to look at Sherman once again and his, I don't know if they're a little over the line, his total warfare, but has a major impact not just on the South economically, socially, but also on this election. Another thing, and I don't know if I have a visual that we don't want to overlook, is that 180,000 freed slaves will fight for the North. Now, not just freed slaves, freed men, ex-slaves, but 180,000 black soldiers. That is a large amount that we need to make sure that we talk about.
Well, and you bring up the point of numbers, and it's actually a pretty significant point that you and when you bring this up too, because at this point in the scheme of things, with Sherman marching through the South and killing off manpower, even the Confederacy makes a point at several times at this point in the war. They make an effort to allow slaves to fight for the Confederacy. So these guys, the slave issue and the former slave issue is a tipping point, because this brings in yet even more men into the Northern Army, and takes away men from the Confederacy to the point where they say, look, we can't keep up. This is just one more nail in the coffin of the Confederacy. Whereas, so much so that they say, well, gosh, we've got to let slaves fight because we don't have people to fight for ourselves. We're going to put slaves in Confederate uniforms to fight ultimately for slavery, because we simply don't have the manpower to do that. And so the North, on the other side, the North is able to they just keep pouring it in. They keep pouring salt in that Confederate wound to really drive home the point. It's gas on the fire. So it's no small feat what these men did, for the North at least.
From a civics and government perspective, we also should look at, these are now black men as part of the military, which is a job within the federal government. So we now, if we look over the scale of the 200 odd years of history of America, we go from Africans being brought to the country in bondage to now having positions, although it may be on the lower end of the executive branch, but still having a job with the United States government. And if you're tracking the progress,
that's progress.
It is progress. Then there's a lot of ways you can look and say, well, why did it take so long? You could look at this negatively, you could look at this positively, but that being said, it is a step forward for African Americans in this country, one of the early milestones for African Americans. And then we're going to wrap the war up here at Appomattox Courthouse, or Bennett Place, Durham, North Carolina, is where Sherman and I believe
Joseph E. Johnston,
they will do a surrender there. But sorry, Durham.
I'm just laughing that you have to bring Sherman back into this.
Well, the more famous of the two will be Appomattox's surrender with Lee and Grant after the burning of Richmond, which is still debated today. Some say the Union burnt Richmond. Others say that was actually the Southerners who burnt Richmond to the ground. You would have to ask who's the lead singer of the band? Lee Von Helm.
Lee Von Helm.
You have to ask Lee Von Helm what the truth is. That's a reference for our students that they will never understand. At least mine will never get.
The band? Who? The band?
What band? What band? The band. What band? Anyway, once again, jokes that no one understands. So Appomattox Courthouse will be final surrender, and that's pretty much it. Anything you want to add to Appomattox? If you ever get a chance to visit there,
it's neat.
Not much. It's neat, but there's not much there. It's just it's neat that it's still the way basically it was. It's some farmhouses. It's the middle of nowhere.
Well, two points, real interesting. The McLean house that the Appomattox Courthouse, the Appomattox surrender was signed in. The McLeans actually left Bull Run because of the Battle of Bull Run, and then they moved to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, hoping to get away from the war, and then the war ends in their house. So the war started around their house, and the war ended around their house. And the other interesting thing, since we're talking progress for minorities,
well, let me stop real quick for our students.
Yeah, do that, because I got to look this guy's name up.
For our English language arts standards here in the state of North Carolina, I believe irony is one of the standards that we want to discuss, and the story that Mr. V just gave you, that would be the definition of irony. The people who were in the first battle moved to avoid battles, and then they end up being the exact place where the last battle, even though it's not really a battle, but the last showdown takes place. That is irony. Basically, when you get the opposite outcome, often leads us to laugh or think, oh, that's funny. All right, go ahead, Mr. B.
All right. Oh, shoot. Eli Parker. Eli Parker, who was an Iroquois chief, actually accepted the formal surrender from Robert E. Lee. And so there's progress for Native Americans here in the Civil War as well. Eli Parker goes on to serve in a couple of different roles, official roles in the Grant administration, but he was Ulysses S. Grant's right-hand man, and so Eli Parker accepts the formal surrender of Robert E. Lee. So there's some progress for Native Americans even in the middle of the Civil War.
Well, also going on that American Indian or Native American point, the Winfield Scott that we were talking about earlier, who devised the major plan for the Union, he was the lead general in charge of the Trail of Tears, I believe. Or was he a private?
Yeah. No, I think he was probably a major at that point. He was probably a middle grade officer at that point.
Yeah. So we've covered now American Indians, check. So you can tell our curriculum advisors, we've worked that in.
Yes.
Wrapping up the war, final points that you want to give to the students. I guess my final points would be there are a lot of great Civil War films that you can dive into. There's a lot more strategy. There's a lot more unique events and conspiracies. Hidden Confederate gold supposedly is still floating around the United States.
Freemasons.
There's a lot of things that you really could dive into right under your feet, especially if you live in the southern states. A lot of history, and we really didn't even talk anything about slaves or slavery or the American or the African American soldiers that fought. Glory is a great film that you could check out about African American soldiers during the Civil War. There really is just a ton of research, and we already went way too long on this video, barely even covering anything. So this should give you an idea of just how much there is involved in this war. Probably in terms of academics and history, I would want to say, if not World War II, this is probably the biggest war for social studies students. What do you think, Mr. B?
Oh, I agree. It's kind of the first, if you ever have an inclination as a kid to get into history, that's what everybody always gives you books on. I mean, if I had a nickel for every Civil War book I'd ever been given, I could probably retire now. And so, I mean, that's what you get into as a little kid, and you kind of have to get into that because that's what most people understand and remember and know. World War II is kind of coming along as being one of the next big things. But yeah, the Civil War, it's a great thing to get your feet wet in history, and you can get your feet wet with the Civil War, and then get into the political side and get into all kinds of other stuff just from the Civil War. So yeah, just enjoy it.
The unique thing about the Civil War, when we study other wars, we only get the American perspective. We don't really dive into what were the British thinking during the Revolutionary War, or we don't break down all the German letters home, or what was Germany doing during World War II. Whereas when we study the Civil War, both sides are our sides. Both sides are American. Every letter written home to a soldier is written in English. We can really break down both points of view. We understand both points of view. Oftentimes when we study wars with other countries, we don't really know how the people tick. We can't really relate with the Germans, or we can't relate today with fundamentalist Islamic terrorists. We have a hard time getting into that mindset. Whereas for me, if I'm studying the Civil War in Ohio during the 1990s, I still kind of understand the perspective of a Southern soldier, or of a poor Southern man, or of a Southern plantation owner, because in the end, they're still Americans.
Right.
It's the same kind of Christian ideas, the same economic beliefs, the same ideas in government. So you really, when we say Civil War, we understand the whole thing 360, all perspectives.
Sure.
This is really one of the few times that we can do that.
Well, and you talk about it as a little kid. I mean, my hometown had a minor Civil War battle, and so I could go and in my mind, you know, I read a book about it, and in my mind, I go to the actual place. We can't, you know, as people of the means that we are, I can't just pick up and go to a World War II battlefield, or I can't go to a World War I battlefield or a Vietnam battlefield, but I can go to a Civil War battlefield and see in my mind and get fired up about it. My parents have been to more, bless their hearts, I love them to death, but they've been to more Civil War battlefields than they probably ever imagined they would end up going, because they had a son who was a history major. And so, I mean, it's something that we can experience in 2014, very similar to what was going on in 1864 or 1865. So it's a good point to end on, I think, is that we can experience the Civil War like no other war that we have.
Definitely. All right, guys, thanks for joining us. We will be back again, maybe a little more succinctly in the future. But this was a big one. We went through a lot of battles, so that's why it was so long. Thanks. Check out my website, Social Studies Games. .us or Mr. B's website. Mr. B, where's your stuff at?
We are at TMS History page, or excuse me, TMS History 2014.blogspot.com. It's a little bit longer, a little bit more personalized to my stuff, but check us out there too.
Yeah, there's still a lot of good resources for parents, students, and other social studies teachers, especially in the state of North Carolina. But I would say any state, because our standards are so broad that I think what we create, it could be used by everybody. All right, thanks, guys. We will see you next time.